It is said my neighbors can set their clocks by my afternoon walks. That's very true, I'm afraid. One day, however, I broke my routine, a rare occurrence, because I had just begun reading Rousseau's Emile. I found his ideas on education and human dignity so absorbing that I completely lost track of time. For a man as punctual as I, this was quite the scandal. It demonstrates how profoundly ideas can move us, even disrupting the most rigid habits.
Welcome to the Undead Sages podcast, where we travel back in time to talk to long-dead wise men and women. Of special interest is the question how sensitive people like you and me can live rich and meaningful lives in our uncertain times. My name is Merijn de Haen, and today we'll be talking to one of the most influential philosophers of all time, Immanuel Kant. Mr. Kant is a German philosopher who was born exactly 300 years ago. He spent his entire life in the city of Königsberg, which came up before in our podcast, when we talked with Hannah Arendt, who grew up there. His works laid the foundation for modern philosophy, reshaping our understanding of knowledge, ethics, and the limits of human reason. His most famous work, The Critique of Pure Reason, explores how our minds actively structure our experience of the world. Kant's insights continue to influence everything from science to morality to aesthetics. So let's travel back in time to a coffee shop in 18th century Prussia and meet him. Herr Kant, welcome to the podcast.
Danke schön. It's a pleasure to meet you.
This place has such an energy about it. Is this a typical Königsberg coffee house?
Indeed, it is. You'll find that coffee houses like this one are at the heart of Königsberg's intellectual life. Look around. Merchants, students, academics, even the occasional traveler from a distant port, they all gather here. It's a place where ideas are exchanged as freely as the cups of coffee.
I can hear snippets of conversation, some debating politics, others science. Do you think this kind of space reflects the Enlightenment spirit?
Absolutely. The Enlightenment is all about reason, dialogue, and the free exchange of ideas. A place like this embodies those principles. You see, Königsberg may not be as grand as Paris, but it's no less connected to the intellectual currents of the time. Books and ideas arrive here by ship, and in places like this, they're discussed, challenged, and refined.
And yet you're famously a man of routine. Do you visit coffee houses often?
Not often, no. My routines are the foundation of my work. Early mornings for writing, afternoons for teaching, and of course, my daily walk. But I do make exceptions when the conversation promises to be worthwhile. There's a certain charm in stepping into this lively world, hearing what the students are debating, or catching up with colleagues over a good cup of coffee.
Do you remember the first time you visited a place like this?
I was a young man then, still a student at the university. Königsberg's coffee houses were smaller and simpler in those days, but they were already hubs of discussion. I remember being struck by how ideas flowed so naturally. It felt like stepping into the very essence of the Enlightenment, reason and curiosity at work.
Did those early conversations shape your philosophy?
In many ways, yes. As a student, I was deeply influenced by the discussions here, particularly about science. Newton's work was a popular topic, his laws of motion, his ideas about space and time. It planted the seeds of questions I would later explore in my own work. For instance, how does the mind grasp such concepts? Are they part of the world, or do we impose them on it?
And now, decades later, do you find the spirit of these coffee houses has changed?
The spirit remains the same, though the topics evolve. Today, you'll hear people debating Rousseau's views on education or the role of freedom in society. These discussions reflect the Enlightenment's growing focus on human progress and morality. It's fascinating to see how ideas spark and spread in places like this.
And Königsberg itself, how does the city contribute to this spirit?
Königsberg is modest but vital. Its port connects us to the wider world, and its university nurtures inquiry and debate. I've spent my entire life here, and I can say without hesitation that it's a city where the Enlightenment thrives. The university, the coffee houses, even the streets I walk daily, they all provide an environment conducive to thought and discovery.
You mentioned Rousseau earlier. Would you say his ideas influenced you?
Profoundly. Rousseau challenged me to think about human dignity and the role of freedom in moral action. I still recall reading his Emile and feeling so moved that I broke my routine, a rare occurrence. His ideas about the potential for human improvement resonated deeply with me and shaped my moral philosophy.
So, sitting here in this coffee house, surrounded by the buzz of conversation, do you feel connected to the broader Enlightenment movement?
Very much so. The Enlightenment is not confined to any single city or thinker. It's a spirit of inquiry and progress that travels wherever reason is valued. Königsberg, modest as it may seem, is part of that larger story. In places like this coffee house, they're its beating heart.
So, before we dive into your groundbreaking ideas, could you tell us a bit about your life and background?
Certainly. I was born right here in Königsberg in 1724. It is a modest but vibrant place, a hub of trade and intellectual activity. My father was a saddler, and we lived simply, but my family instilled in me a strong sense of discipline and moral integrity, deeply influenced by Pietist teachings. As a boy, I attended the Collegium Fridericianum, where I received a rigorous education in the classics, languages, and religion. I was a diligent student, and this early training cultivated my love of learning. Later, I entered the University of Königsberg, where I immersed myself in philosophy, mathematics, and the natural sciences.
Did you always intend to become a philosopher?
Not at first. I began my academic career as a private tutor to support myself, and I also considered a career in theology. However, my true passion lay in philosophy, especially in understanding the nature of knowledge, reason, and morality. Over time, I realized that philosophy was the best way to pursue these questions.
You're known for having spent almost your entire life here in Königsberg. Do you ever feel the urge to travel?
I am content in Königsberg, which provides a stable environment for my intellectual pursuits. I've always been a man of routine, and I find that a quiet, disciplined life suits me. Though I rarely travel, the world comes to me through books, correspondence, and conversations. My mind roams far and wide, even if my body remains in Königsberg.
Your routines are legendary. Could you share a bit about your daily life?
I rise early at 5 a.m. and begin my day with reflection and study. My mornings are devoted to writing and preparing lectures, as my mind is sharpest then. After teaching at the university, I take a daily walk at the same time each afternoon, a habit so regular that locals joked they could set their clocks by me. Evenings are for reading and occasionally entertaining friends, though I prefer small gatherings. Routine helps me focus and brings clarity to my thoughts.
How do your students and peers perceive you?
They likely see me as disciplined and rigorous, both in my work and in my expectations of others. But I'd like to think they also see my humor and my genuine interest in their intellectual growth. Philosophy is not just abstract reasoning, it's a way of life. and I've always tried to convey that in my teaching and discussions.
So let's dive into your work. Could you tell us what inspired your critique of pure reason?
Well, the critique of pure reason is the result of my attempt to resolve a philosophical puzzle. How is it that we humans can have knowledge of the world at all? I was deeply influenced by the ideas of earlier philosophers like René Descartes, who emphasized reason, and David Hume, who championed sensory experience but also questioned the certainty of knowledge. Hume, in particular, awakened me from my dogmatic slumber. He challenged the idea that concepts like causality are derived from the world itself, which forced me to rethink how the mind works. My goal in the critique was to establish a secure foundation for knowledge by investigating the very structures of human thought. How do we even understand the world? Clearly, we have the different sense organs, but there is something in the mind that organizes and evaluates all that information. How does that work? That is what interested me in my earlier years.
Fascinating. One of the terms you use repeatedly in your work is transcendental. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Of course. When I use the word transcendental, I'm not talking about mystical or otherworldly ideas. Instead, I mean something very specific. The conditions that make human experience and knowledge possible. In other words, I'm interested in the structures of the mind, such as space, time, and certain concepts like causality that shape how we perceive and understand the world. My transcendental philosophy focuses on these preconditions, which are a priori, meaning they are independent of sensory experience. Without them, we could not make sense of the chaotic data we receive through our senses.
So, your philosophy is a kind of investigation into the architecture of human cognition?
Precisely. I argue that the mind is not a passive recipient of information. Instead, it actively organizes sensory input into coherent knowledge. For instance, space and time are not properties of the external world, but forms of intuition, mental frameworks that structure all our perceptions. Similarly, causality and other concepts are categories of understanding that the mind applies to connect and interpret sensory data.
You've mentioned space, time, and the categories. Can you give us a clearer picture of these categories and why they're important?
Certainly. You can think of these things like scaffolding that exists in the mind in order for us to make sense of what we perceive. Space and time have no actual existence in the world, and even if they did, we couldn't possibly know it. Our mind manufactures space and time, like shelves in a storeroom, to help us manage our experiences, and not just our memories, which you might think of when I use the word storeroom. Space and time are generated by your mind right now. You need them right now in order for us to have this conversation. The same goes for the categories. The categories of understanding are fundamental concepts that the mind uses to structure experience. There are 12 of them, divided into 4 groups. Quantity categories help us determine how much of something there is. Quality categories help us see the reality, negation, and limitations of what we perceive and think. Then there are the relationality categories that help us determine how mental objects are related to each other. Causality, for example. Finally, there are the categories of modality, helping us see whether a mental object exists, might exist, or needs to exist. Take causality as an example. When we see one event follow another, the mind imposes the concept of cause and effect, allowing us to understand the relationship between those events. Without these categories, we would experience the world as a chaotic jumble of sensations with no coherence.
That's fascinating, but also a bit abstract. How does this apply to everyday knowledge or science?
Excellent question. The categories, along with space and time, are the reason we can have objective knowledge of the world at all. For example, science depends on the principle of causality. Without it, we couldn't perform experiments or draw conclusions about the laws of nature. At the same time, my philosophy reminds us that these concepts are not features of the world as it is in itself, or noumena, but a part of how the mind structures the world as it appears to us, or phenomena.
Ah, the noumenal and the phenomenal. That sounds similar to Plato's idea of the world of forms versus the world of appearances. Is there a connection?
There is a resemblance, but there are also significant differences. Plato believed we could transcend the world of appearances and access the eternal, unchanging forms through reason. In contrast, I argue that the noumenon, or the thing in itself, is fundamentally unknowable. We can acknowledge its existence as the source of our perceptions, but we can never experience or comprehend it directly. My project focuses on the limits of human knowledge, what we can and cannot know.
Some might say that makes your philosophy a bit pessimistic. What would you say to that?
I don't see it as pessimistic at all. By recognizing the boundaries of reason, we gain clarity about what we can achieve. My philosophy leaves space for faith and practical reasoning. For example, while theoretical reason cannot prove the existence of God, freedom, or immortality, these ideas are still vital for moral philosophy, which I address in my later works.
So your first critique can be seen as a way to clarify the arena of cognition, to get clarity about how human cognition operates. By taking time to carefully define what human understanding through reason can comment on, and what it can't, we gain insight into where exactly we can direct this powerful tool of ours, and where it might be less relevant.
Ah, yes, you've captured it well. My critique of pure reason is indeed about clarifying the workings of human cognition. By defining what reason can and cannot achieve, we can avoid missteps and direct this powerful tool where it's most effective. Reason is extraordinary. It lets us uncover the laws of nature, build scientific theories, and create profound ethical systems. But it has limits. When reason tries to extend beyond experience, speculating about God, the soul, or the universe's ultimate nature, it overreaches. I call these missteps transcendental illusions. My critique aims to guard against them. Instead, reason works best when focused on the phenomenal world, the reality we experience shaped by the mind's frameworks like space, time, and causality. Within this realm, reason excels, especially in science, where it helps us understand nature systematically. But the noumenal world, reality as it is in itself, lies beyond our grasp. Recognizing this boundary is not defeat, it's a mark of intellectual maturity. This clarity also has practical benefits. By limiting theoretical reason, we make room for practical reason, the realm of morality. While we can't prove the existence of God or freedom, we can act as if they're real because they're essential for ethical life. This approach balances humility about what we can know with empowerment in how we live and act.
Your philosophy has been incredibly influential, but it has also faced critiques. For instance, some argue that your categories might not be as universal as you claim. Could you respond to that?
Ah, yes, this is a compelling critique. Critics like Hegel argued that the categories are not fixed or universal, but evolve historically through cultural and intellectual development. Others, including contemporary anthropologists and cognitive scientists, suggest that the way humans structure knowledge is influenced by cultural practices and emotional contexts. While I maintain that the categories are universal preconditions for any possible experience, I acknowledge that the ways they manifest might vary. For example, all humans may use the concept of causality, but how different cultures interpret causality can differ significantly. This is an area where dialogue with other traditions, including Eastern philosophies, could enrich my framework.
Speaking of Eastern philosophies, some have drawn parallels between your ideas and Buddhist thought. Were you aware of these connections?
I was not directly influenced by Eastern thought, as it was largely unknown in my time. However, the similarities are intriguing. For instance, Buddhist philosophy's distinction between conventional and ultimate reality mirrors my division between phenomena and noumena. Additionally, Hume, who deeply influenced me, shares remarkable parallels with Buddhist ideas about the self and causality. If these ideas reached me indirectly through Hume, it would only underscore the universality of such insights.
So, is there anything about the critique of pure reason we haven't covered that you think is important?
Perhaps one final point. The critique is not merely an intellectual exercise. Its purpose is deeply practical. By clarifying the limits of human knowledge, it provides a foundation for science, philosophy, and morality. It teaches us humility, recognizing the boundaries of what we can know, while also empowering us to use reason boldly within those boundaries.
Your ideas about morality have had a profound impact on philosophy. Can you explain the foundation of your moral philosophy?
Certainly. At its heart, my moral philosophy seeks to answer a simple but profound question. What makes an action morally good? Many suggest morality is about achieving happiness, helping others, or following divine commandments. While these are important, I argue that true morality must be rooted in reason itself.
Why focus on reason?
Because reason is universal. It's the one faculty all rational beings share. Morality based on reason isn't subject to personal desires or circumstances. It's grounded in principles that apply to everyone. For an action to be morally good, it must be guided by such principles, not by self-interest or fleeting emotions.
That sounds very structured. Is this where your concept of the categorical imperative comes in?
Exactly. The categorical imperative is the cornerstone of my moral philosophy. Unlike hypothetical imperatives, which depend on achieving specific goals, if you want to stay healthy, exercise. The categorical imperative is unconditional. It tells us what we ought to do simply because it's the right thing to do.
Can you give us an example of the categorical imperative in action?
Of course. I express the categorical imperative in several ways, but let's start with the formula of universal law. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. This means that before you act, ask yourself, what if everyone acted this way? For instance, take lying. If everyone lied, trust would disappear, and lying would become self-defeating. Therefore, lying cannot be a moral act.
That's a powerful framework. What's the second formulation?
The second is the formula of humanity. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in another, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. This highlights the intrinsic worth of every individual. People are not tools to achieve our goals. They have inherent dignity and must always be respected.
Does this mean you see morality as tied to freedom?
Precisely. Morality is about autonomy or self-governance. To act morally is to act according to laws we give ourselves through reason, rather than being driven by external pressures or internal desires. This is true freedom, not doing whatever we want, but choosing what is right because it aligns with rational principles.
And yet, many people think of morality as a matter of duty. How does that fit in?
Duty arises because we are not purely rational beings. we are also creatures of inclination and desire. Often, our impulses conflict with what reason demands. When we act morally, we do so out of duty, not because it benefits us, but because it's the right thing to do. Only then does an action have true moral worth.
Can you give an example?
Imagine helping a friend. If you do it because it makes you feel good, your action is kind but not necessarily moral. If you help them because you recognize a duty to support others, even when it's inconvenient, that's where moral worth lies.
That seems quite demanding. Do you think your framework is practical?
It is demanding, but morality is not meant to be easy. It's meant to guide us toward what is right. My framework applies to real-life situations. For example, it tells us why honesty is essential, even when lying might benefit us. It shows why we should help others, not out of pity, but out of respect for their dignity.
How does your moral philosophy connect to ideas like God or immortality?
While my moral philosophy is grounded in reason, I argue that certain ideas, like God, freedom, and immortality, are postulates of practical reason. They aren't proven by theoretical reason, but they are necessary for moral life. For instance, belief in freedom underpins our sense of moral responsibility, and the idea of a just God ensures that morality remains meaningful even when virtue and happiness don't align in this life.
So morality isn't just about rules. It's about respecting human dignity and embracing freedom.
Exactly. Morality is a way of honoring the inherent worth of every rational being, including ourselves. It's about rising above selfish desires and acting from principles that respect this dignity.
Final question. How can sensitive people live rich and meaningful lives?
That's a wonderful question. For a sensitive person, living a good life means finding balance between the depth of their emotions and the steady guidance of reason. Sensitivity is a gift. It allows you to empathize with others, appreciate beauty, and connect deeply to the world around you. But it can also be overwhelming if left unchecked. The key is to harmonize your emotional nature with the moral principles that reason provides. First, I'd say this. Don't let your emotions dictate your actions. It's natural for sensitive people to feel compassion or sorrow deeply, but your choices should be guided by what's right, not just what you feel in the moment. Acting from duty, doing what's morally good because it's the right thing to do, gives your actions a firm foundation. Second, remember to respect yourself as much as you respect others. Sensitive people often give so much of themselves that they forget their own worth. But the moral law applies to everyone equally, which means you, too, are an end in yourself. Care for others, yes, but don't neglect your own dignity. Finally, I'd encourage you to seek inner freedom. True freedom isn't about following every feeling or impulse. It's about acting from principles you've chosen for yourself through reason. For someone who feels deeply, this might mean pausing to reflect before acting, ensuring your choices align with what's truly right. So, in short, embrace your sensitivity. It's a beautiful quality, but let reason and respect guide you. That's how a sensitive person can live a truly good and meaningful life.
Immanuel Kant, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Merijn. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Undead Sages podcast. If you've enjoyed this conversation with Immanuel Kant, please share it with your friends, rate the episode, leave a comment, and subscribe to the podcast.